When we talk about war, most people imagine soldiers in uniforms, tanks on battlefields, and flags waving in victory. But the reality is that war is not only about territory, weapons, or politics. It is a force that penetrates the deepest layers of the human mind, reshaping thoughts, emotions, and identities in ways that can never fully be undone. And the dark psychology of war reveals itself not in the strategies of generals, but in the nightmares of survivors, the quiet despair of soldiers who return home but cannot find peace, in the silent screams of children whose lives are shattered before they even learn to speak, and in the invisible fractures carried within societies long after the bombs stop falling, because while governments count losses in numbers of dead and wounded, the true legacy of war lies in the psychological wounds that live on for decades, spreading from one generation to the next like a shadow that refuses to fade. And to understand this darkness, we must step into the minds of those who lived through war, exploring how fear, trauma, guilt, and violence transform human beings forever, stripping away innocence, reshaping morality, and leaving scars that words cannot always capture, yet must always be acknowledged. Because only by confronting these truths can we grasp the full cost of human conflict, and perhaps find ways to resist repeating the same cycles of destruction again and again. When we look deeper into the psychological disorders caused by wars, it becomes clear that the human mind is often the longest-lasting casualty. Because while wounds of the body may heal with time, the mind often continues to bleed invisibly. And among the most well-known conditions is post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, a term that captures the haunting flashbacks, intrusive memories, nightmares, and sudden panic attacks experienced by survivors who cannot escape the battlefield even when they are physically safe. As loud noises, sudden lights, or even familiar smells can trigger overwhelming fear that throws them back into moments of combat or terror, making ordinary life almost impossible. And while PTSD is often associated with soldiers, it does not discriminate. It affects refugees, civilians, prisoners of war, journalists, and humanitarian workers, essentially anyone exposed to prolonged violence and fear. And this condition reflects the way war rewires the brain, keeping the body in a constant state of hypervigilance. Unable to relax or trust safety, a mental prison from which escape feels impossible. Yet PTSD is only one piece of the puzzle, because war also fuels widespread depression, where survivors lose interest in life, feel an overwhelming sense of guilt for surviving when others did not, and withdraw from their families and communities, sometimes turning to alcohol or drugs to numb their pain, which only deepens their isolation and accelerates their decline. And then there is generalized anxiety disorder, where survivors live in constant fear, scanning every corner for danger, unable to sleep peacefully, and forever bracing themselves for threats that no longer exist, but which their minds cannot stop anticipating. And perhaps even more haunting is the phenomenon of moral injury, a psychological wound not caused by fear but by guilt and shame. When soldiers are forced to commit acts that go against their conscience, such as killing civilians, witnessing comrades die without being able to help, or being ordered into situations where every choice feels wrong, and while commanders may dismiss such acts as collateral damage, the soldier's conscience never forgets, replaying the moment endlessly, tormenting the individual with shame that corrodes identity and meaning, often leading to suicidal thoughts and an inability to reconnect with society. And this dark truth explains why many veterans return home physically intact, yet feel like strangers in their own families, unable to connect with loved ones, unable to hold jobs, trapped in cycles of rage, isolation, and despair. And tragically, suicide rates among war veterans remain alarmingly high, reflecting the fatal weight of invisible wounds. And beyond these conditions, war also produces what psychologists call somatic symptoms, where unresolved trauma expresses itself through unexplained body pain, chronic fatigue, digestive issues, or heart problems, all of which have no physical illness at their root, but are instead the body's way of carrying psychological pain. And when such trauma goes untreated, it creates devastating ripple effects, breaking families, fueling unemployment and homelessness, and in some cases even leading to crime, as individuals struggling with trauma lash out against societies that fail to understand them. And historically, this neglect has been widespread, as societies celebrate soldiers as heroes but remain blind to their inner battles, offering parades instead of therapy, medals instead of healing, which is why the dark psychology of war must be understood not only as personal suffering, but as a collective failure to acknowledge and address the invisible wounds of conflict. Because left untreated, they not only destroy individual lives, but erode the stability of entire nations that depend on healthy citizens to rebuild peace. The psychological impact of wars on civilians, especially children, is perhaps even more devastating than on soldiers. Because unlike those who train for combat, civilians are thrust into the horrors of war without preparation, and for them, the battlefield is not some distant land but their own streets, homes, and schools. Places that once symbolized safety and routine, but are suddenly transformed into death traps, where every knock at the door could be soldiers. Every rumble in the sky could be bombs, and every night could mean the end of their world. And when civilians are forced to flee their homes in the dead of night, when families are separated, when parents are killed before the eyes of their children, the trauma imprinted on their minds is profound and lifelong. And psychologists working with refugees consistently observe symptoms of PTSD, depression, and what is known as complex trauma, which develops not from a single terrifying event, but from years of repeated exposure to violence, displacement, and insecurity, leaving survivors unable to trust stability even when peace returns. And civilians face additional layers of suffering, such as poverty, hunger, homelessness, and the breakdown of community bonds, all of which compound their mental distress. And among civilians, children are the most vulnerable because they're developing. Brains are deeply sensitive to stress, and when their formative years are defined by explosions, hunger, and fear, their entire emotional development is warped, leaving them either aggressive and distrustful or withdrawn and insecure. Many of these children grow into adults who carry unresolved trauma, which they unconsciously pass on to their own children in the form of transgenerational trauma, meaning that the war never truly ends because its psychological legacy is carried into future generations. And women to suffer uniquely, as they often bear the brunt of displacement, caregiving, and sexual violence during conflict experiences that leave lasting wounds of fear, shame, and stigma, making it difficult for them to reintegrate into their communities, even when peace is restored. While the elderly experience the devastation of watching everything they built, homes, families, traditions, destroyed before their eyes, leaving them with deep hopelessness and depression, and tragically, despite the scale of this suffering, civilians rarely receive systematic psychological care after wars, as most humanitarian aid focuses on food, shelter, and physical safety. While the invisible wounds go untreated, and yet the signs of this untreated trauma are everywhere. In the refugee child who wakes screaming from nightmares, in the mother who panics every time her child leaves the house, fearing they may never return, in the family who cannot sit through a thunderstorm without reliving the sound of shelling. And beyond individual suffering, the collective psyche of entire communities is reshaped. As trust between neighbors erodes, cycles of revenge and mistrust deepen, entire societies are destabilized, making the rebuilding of peace even more fragile. And this illustrates the darkest irony of war. While politicians may call civilian deaths collateral damage, the reality is that civilians carry the heaviest burden of all, not just in terms of numbers lost, but in psychological suffering that continues long after the last bullet is fired, and unless this suffering is acknowledged and healed, it becomes fertile ground for future conflicts. As traumatized children grow into adults who struggle to build peace, creating a vicious cycle, where war breeds more war, ensuring that the psychological cost of conflict is never truly paid. To fully grasp the depth of war's psychological toll, we must turn to case studies that illustrate how individuals and societies have been scarred across different eras. Because while statistics offer numbers, only personal and collective stories capture the true magnitude of human suffering. And one of the earliest large-scale examples is World War I, where trench warfare subjected soldiers to unimaginable stress as they lived for months in mud, surrounded by death under constant artillery fire, leading to what was called shell shock, a condition that left thousands unable to function, many of whom were institutionalized, stigmatized, or left untreated. And the lessons of this horror, carried into World War II, where not only soldiers but civilians faced psychological devastation. As cities like London, Dresden, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki were bombed relentlessly, leaving children to grow up in shelters, forever shaped by the constant fear of air raid, while Holocaust survivors endured traumas so profound that they struggled with nightmares, flashbacks, and profound mistrust for the rest of their lives, and their children, even those born after the war, often carried inherited trauma through silence, fear, and fragmented family dynamics, demonstrating that war can echo across generations. And then came the Vietnam War, which brought the concept of PTSD into mainstream recognition, as returning American veterans spoke openly about their flashbacks, insomnia, alienation, and reliance on drugs or alcohol to cope, forcing psychiatry to formally acknowledge PTSD in the 1980s, a turning point in how war trauma was understood globally. And more recently, conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq revealed similar patterns, with soldiers struggling to reintegrate into societies that celebrated them as heroes yet failed to understand their silent suffering, while civilians, especially women and children, endured displacement, bombings, and loss of loved ones, reporting overwhelming mental health challenges. And beyond these military examples, the late 20th and early 21st centuries provide equally devastating civilian case studies. From the Rwandan genocide, to the Balkan Wars, to the Syrian civil war, where survivors describe identical symptoms of nightmares, distrust, and despair, proving that trauma transcends geography, culture, and religion, and modern warfare has added new dimensions. Because today wars are not confined to battlefields, but are broadcast into living rooms around the world, creating what psychologists call vicarious trauma, where even those not directly involved in conflicts experience stress and despair by constantly consuming violent imagery. And for those within war zones, technology has made fear omnipresent, as drones hover invisibly overhead, instilling paranoia. Or cyber warfare disrupts infrastructure, creating insecurity and helplessness. And because modern conflicts often involve terrorism, insurgencies, and irregular combat, civilians are deliberately targeted, making their trauma far more widespread than in traditional wars. And these case studies collectively reveal a disturbing truth, that while weapons evolve, the human mind continues to respond in the same tragic patterns of fear, grief, guilt, and helplessness, leaving us to confront the reality that the psychological legacy of war is not only unavoidable, but universal, affecting combatants, survivors, and even distant observers, spreading ripples of trauma across the globe. If we are to consider the full consequences of the dark psychology of war, we must not only examine its symptoms in case studies, but also reflect on its broader implications for humanity. Because war does not simply end when treaties are signed, or when armies withdraw. It lives on in the minds of those who endured it, shaping societies in invisible but profound ways. And one of the most haunting consequences is transgenerational trauma, where the children of survivors inherit fear, mistrust, silence, or aggression. Not through blood, but through family dynamics, cultural narratives, and unspoken memories. Meaning that the mental cost of war perpetuates across decades, ensuring that peace is always fragile. And this cycle demonstrates how wars undermine not only the present, but also the future, creating citizens who struggle to trust, to love, and to build stability. And another critical implication lies in the role of propaganda. Because war is not only fought on battlefields, but in minds. As leaders use fear, hatred, and manipulation to justify violence, to dehumanize the enemy, and to maintain power, which shows that the psychology of war extends beyond trauma into deliberate social engineering, where entire populations are reshaped to accept or even celebrate destruction, and once peace returns. Societies must confront not only broken bodies and destroyed buildings, but also broken trust, fractured identities, and normalized violence, challenges that often prove harder to heal than physical wounds. And this is why many post-war societies experience long periods of instability, cycles of revenge and recurring conflict, because the psychological scars prevent true reconciliation. And while modern psychology has made great strides in diagnosing and treating conditions like PTSD, depression, and anxiety, the reality is that mental health care remains severely underfunded and underprioritized in conflict zones, meaning that millions of survivors never receive the support they need, leaving them to suffer silently and to spread their pain to those around them. And yet, despite all this darkness, the human mind also carries resilience, as history shows. Countless examples of survivors who rebuild, who turn trauma into art, literature, activism, and leadership, proving that while war reshapes the mind in terrifying ways, it also reveals hidden strengths. And the task before humanity is to recognize both sides of this truth, to provide care for the wounded, to educate societies about the invisible costs of war, and to resist the manipulations that make wars possible in the first place, because only then can we hope to break the cycle. To ensure that the dark psychology of war no longer defines our collective destiny but instead becomes a warning, a reminder that the greatest battlefield is not the land we fight over, but the minds we leave scarred. And the greatest victory is not defeating enemies, but healing humanity. For in the end, the true cost of war is not measured in destroyed cities or fallen armies, but in the invisible suffering carried silently in millions of minds across generations. A cost so immense that it should compel us to question every war before it begins.